Good morning. Can everyone hear me? All right. So this is my first time speaking on a Sunday morning, so if this goes south fast, you can blame Brother Richard for letting me do this. But I am thankful for the chance to do this, and today I want to talk about something that I have been studying lately, and the title of today's sermon, I called it The Stormy Seas of Life. Now, when we first go through the passage, it may not make much sense as to why that's the title, but hopefully by the end it'll make sense. So if you will, turn to Psalm 74, and we're going to be starting in verse 12, and this should all be on the screen. And here's what it says. We'll go 12 through, I think it's 17. Yet God is my king from of old, who works deeds of deliverance in the midst of the earth. You divided the sea by your strength. You broke the heads of the sea monsters in the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as a food for the creatures of the wilderness. You broke open the springs and torrents. You dried up ever-flowing streams. Yours is the day. Yours is also the night. You have prepared the light and the sun. You have established all the boundaries of the earth. You have made summer and winter. Let us pray. Lord, thank you for this chance for us to come here to your house to worship you and to learn about your word. I pray that as I speak today, I speak your words and not mine. Let today be a blessing for all of us. Let us grow in the knowledge of your word. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so first, background on this psalm. Psalm 74 was written during the Babylonian exile. So this is when, of course, Babylon came in and just swept through Judah, destroyed everything, took a bunch of the people back to Babylon with them. And this is one of the, if not the lowest point in Israel's history. There is an entire book called Lamentations that Jeremiah wrote just mourning this loss. People were slaughtered, the land was overrun, the temple was destroyed. And if you look through verses 1 through 11, just kind of breeze through it, you can see the author just lamenting all of this, asking God, why have you rejected us, saying the enemies have run us over. And one interesting thing is, especially verses 3 through 8, he's so concerned not with himself, not even with the people or the nation, but with God's name and about how God has been so put down by his enemy. And the reason for that is in an ancient person's head, a lot of times, and this is how a lot of the cultures around Israel saw it, when they went to battle and one country defeated another, they saw it as the gods of that nation defeating the gods of the other nations. So when Babylon came in and took everything over, they saw it in their heads as their gods defeating the God of Israel. And so, of course, because of that, the author knows God hasn't been defeated, but he's saying, look at what Babylon has done to your name, the way that they have defiled the worshiping places. And so he keeps going through this all the way up to verse 11, just lamenting this, asking God, where are you? Do you see not what they've done to your name? And so that's the background for the section we're reading. And so the few verses I want to look at are 12 through 17. And because there's so much going on here with what he does. So if we start in verse 12, the way he starts is, yet my God is my king from of old, who works deeds of deliverance in the midst of the earth. So to begin with, he starts by reminding them who God is. Even in this awful, terrible time of their history, when the worst thing that you can imagine has happened to them. And he has gone through saying all these horrible things have happened. And of course, then verse 12, he says, yet God. I have heard so many preachers say that one of the most important phrases in the Bible is, but God. You know, there's always something horrible has happened, but God, and then it says, who reminds us of who God is. And this says, yet God, so I guess it's a bit fancier, but still. All right, and so now, the part I want to really focus on is verses 13 and 14, because this is a topic that I've been exploring a bit lately that gets really interesting. So starting in verse 13, you divided the sea by your strength. Now, to us, the idea of dividing the sea or controlling the waters, that's pretty impressive. To an ancient person, it's even more impressive. And one thing that I've been thinking about lately and reading on is trying to read the Bible the way an ancient person would, because this psalm is close to 3,000 years old. So it was written to the people of that time, and a lot of times it uses imagery and language they would understand. So to understand what this means, just imagine with me here. You are an ancient person in the Mediterranean area. You're going to be on the water a lot. They had fishermen, sailors, all kinds of people who would go out on the water. Now, imagine you're out on a boat and a storm hits. Okay? So the water starts getting really bad, the winds start blowing. How much control do you have over that? Pretty much none. So, in their heads, what happened is that sense of being out of control, of not having control over the situation, of the storm hitting and just having this utter chaos and destruction, it became sort of a metaphor or a symbol to them of the way life is chaotic sometimes. Because there are times that life gets bad and there's nothing you can do about it, just like when you're out on the ocean and you can't control it. And this was a very common thought process for a lot of ancient people, and Israel's no different. In fact, I want to go through a few Bible verses that show this, just really quickly. You should be up on the screen. So first of all, Psalm 139, 9 through 10. If I take the wings of the dawn, if I dwell in the remotest part of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, and your right hand will lay hold of me. So here, this psalmist is saying, even in the remotest part of the sea, which to him could also mean in the midst of chaos, God is there. Psalm 93, 3 through 4. This is a really powerful one on this imagery. The floods have lifted up, O Lord. The floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their pounding waves more than the sounds of many waters. Than the mighty breakers of the sea, the Lord on high is mighty. So here he's saying, even when you look at the sea, when it starts getting bad, even the waves and the winds that the sea has, none of them can stand up to who God is. And this is also very common in ancient thought. A lot of the other mythologies around Israel saw controlling the sea as sort of controlling chaos. So when God a lot of times is making a point of who he is, he talks in a way they understand and shows himself as controlling the sea. Jeremiah 51:42. This one uses it in an interesting way. It says, the sea has come up over Babylon. She has been engulfed with its tumultuous waves. Now, this is obviously a pronunciation of judgment on Babylon by God. Now, when Babylon was actually judged, were they underwater? No. What happened was the Persians came in and took them over. So they weren't literally thrown into the sea, but what were they thrown into? Chaos, which is something the ancient people would know very well. Even go back to the very beginning of the Bible, the second verse we ever read, Genesis 1:2. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. So this is a picture of even from the beginning of creation, God is in control of the chaos. And a lot of mythologies around Israel, their creation stories often involved a God having to battle chaos to bring it under control. But Genesis is really unique because as opposed to that, it just has God in control of it from the very beginning. There is no battle. There is no struggle. He's got it. The chaos is completely in his control. So, to an ancient person, that idea of the ocean or the sea being this symbol of chaos is very ingrained in their head. And the biblical authors were aware of this. And when you realize this, it is everywhere, especially in the Old Testament. You'll run across verses that talk about water and never read them the same. So now, imagine that. Now imagine you are a first century Jew. You know your Old Testament. You know these verses about the water. You know what it means. And one day you're out on a boat, and again, the storm starts picking up. Clouds come in, winds get strong. You and all your friends are on that boat, and it looks hopeless. And then your teacher stands up on the boat, tells the ocean, be quiet, and it listens to him. What would that mean to you, knowing what the water symbolizes? And that's exactly what was going through the heads of the disciples when Jesus got out of the boat and told the water to be quiet. I've heard a lot of people say that sort of was Jesus showing his power over nature. But honestly, to an ancient person, they didn't have the sense of nature that we do. And the idea of it being some separate natural world. What they did have was the idea of chaos. And to them, that's what the waters meant. So when Jesus steps out on the boat and he tells it to be quiet, what's going through the disciples' heads is all these verses of God controlling the water, of him having this power over chaos. Not only does Jesus tell the water to be quiet, what else does he do? He walks on it. So not only does he control the chaos of our lives, he puts it under his foot. He steps on it. There's another example in the New Testament. In the book of Revelation, where does the beast come from? The sea. Why? Because it is a chaotic entity. It has come to wreak chaos. And so that's why when John writes Revelation, he's standing on the shore and he sees it come out of the ocean. Any of his readers who knew the Old Testament realize exactly what that was trying to say. All right, so now, next verse, things start to get weird. So second part of verse 13, you broke the heads of the sea monsters in the waters, you crushed the heads of Leviathan. What? That seems to just come out of nowhere in the middle of this. In these verses, he's seeming to talk about creation, and then he brings up the ocean and shows God's power over it, and then just throws this weird name into there and talks about sea monsters, and it kind of makes you stop for a second and say, what is he saying? And I've been listening to a guy named Michael Heiser the past few months, and one thing he says is, if anything in the Bible is weird, that means it's important. And I think this is definitely important. Most of you have probably heard the name Leviathan. It comes up in the book of Job. Towards the end of the book, God has gone through all these parts of creation with Job. This is after all the horrible things have happened in Job's life, and God comes to answer for it. And he walks Job through all these different parts of creation, shows him all these animals. And the point he's making is, do you know this? Do you know that? Can you control this? Can you control that? And of course, no, he can't, because God is the only one who does. And then he ends with these two interesting creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan. And specifically, I want to focus on Leviathan. And I have heard all sorts of theories about what this thing is. Some people say it's a really hyperbolic description of a crocodile. Some say it's a type of dinosaur. Some even say it's some extinct species of dragon we don't know about anymore. And to those people, I say, none of you are thinking big enough. Because, at least from what I have read, I think Leviathan is the ocean. Some of you are looking at me like I have two heads, and I was ready for that. Okay, again, back to how an Israelite would read this. Okay, back out on the ocean. Yes, I know this is our third sailing trip already in this sermon. Okay, when you're out on the ocean, you look down. Sometimes what do you see in the ocean? You may see something swimming by. There's fish in there, sharks, whales, eels, all sorts of things. So they knew very well there were animals in there. So in the same way that an ancient person tied together the idea of the water and chaos, a lot of them had sort of this embodiment of it in a sea dragon. This was very common in ancient mythology. The closest thing I can think of it in modern day would be Godzilla. Because when the original Godzilla movie was made in the 50s, it was a symbol of nuclear war. You know, you had this 100-foot tall monster that walked through buildings, nothing could stop. That's a very strong metaphor for the fear of nuclear war at the time. So in the same way that someone in the 50s would see that, an ancient person would see this name and think chaos or the water. And there's some interesting things that come from this. So, for instance, a lot of stories around the Israelites would have these stories of their God defeating this dragon in battle. And some of you are probably thinking, so is he saying the Old Testament steals from pagan mythology? No, it's not, but they knew the story. They knew what it symbolized. And a lot of times, what would happen is, for instance, here in Psalm 74, when it says you crush the heads of Leviathan, what they are doing is they're taking these stories of other gods from the pagan myths and sort of using the same language about the God of Israel to slap those other gods in the face. Remember what I said earlier about how when Babylon took over, they saw it as their gods taking over or defeating the God of Israel. Well, Babylon is one of those groups who had a myth about their God defeating a dragon to create the world. And so what he's doing here is he's taking that story and reminding them, no. It is not the gods of Babylon. All the power you think your gods have, they have none of it. It is my God who has the true power. And so And so when you go look back at Job, at what he's saying when he brings up Leviathan, it's not about it being a real animal. It's about what it represents in Job's head. And God's point to him is that, can you control chaos? And so that's why it's so relevant in this psalm, because their lives have been completely thrown into chaos. And so when he uses the imagery of him controlling the sea, of him crushing the heads of Leviathan, as it says, that is an imagery they understood as him being in control in the midst of the chaos. Go later on, book of Revelation. What is Satan represented as? A serpent and a dragon. Why? Because he's the author of chaos. And the imagery they had of a dragon would fall right in line with what is being said about Satan in that passage. Some stories from other groups around Israel had Leviathan was having 7 heads. The beast in Revelation, how many heads does it have? 7. It all ties back together. So now, keep reading in verse 14. It says this weird phrase: you gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. What on earth do we do with that? Well, look at this. Verse 13 says, you divided the sea by your strength. 14 says, you gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. Where is there a story that involves separating the sea and the wilderness? The Exodus. When Israel is backed up against the Red Sea, God splits it, and they go through it into the wilderness. So he is using this story, or using this to remind Israel of that story. And so, now imagine, with this in mind, you are a member of the Israelites at the Red Sea as Pharaoh's army is bearing down. And you think you are dead. Your back is against the water, you've got an army coming at you, and then you turn around and you see the sea split in half. Knowing what they thought about the ocean, what would that really say to them? What would that say to Pharaoh's army who saw that? And in their head, how much of a point it must be making about who the real God is. I'm telling you, this is everywhere. And so now he puts that together with this story about Leviathan. Do you think they actually thought he was defeating a dragon in battle as he was splitting the sea? No, that's not the point. The point is what it represents. That was a name they stuck with the ocean. And it was so powerful in their heads. So, if we keep going through this, he continues and says, you broke open the springs and torrents, you dried up ever-flowing streams. Again, just more imagery of him controlling water. And then it says, yours is the day, yours is also the night. You have prepared the light and the sun. You have established all the boundaries of the earth. You have made summer and winter. So then it just finishes by talking about God as creator, saying, who is Babylon to the one who has made the sun? Who is Babylon to the one who has made the seasons? And so just in these few verses, this author, in one big swipe, he reminds them that God is creator. He reminds them with this imagery they know so well that he is in control of all the chaos that happens in their lives, that he is the one who is superior to the gods of Babylon. All the things that Babylon thinks their gods did, no, they didn't do any of it. They have no power. He has all the power. And which was important to remind them because of the thought that their God had either been defeated or had abandoned them to the gods of Babylon. And just all these things in these few verses. And if you read it through what an ancient Israelite would have been seeing, it opens up so much. And it is such a strong reminder of how much God is in control. And so looking through the last few verses, it says, remember this, O Lord, that the enemy has reviled and foolish people spurned your name. It goes on asking for him to remember his people, to come back or to arise, plead his own cause, all these things. And so just reminding God of his promises, his nature, who he is, and asking that he come back and take control. And of course he does. He judges Babylon in the end. The people come back to their land. But I want to end by focusing on, well, the ultimate end, not just the end of the exile. So if you look at Revelation 21:1, this should be up on the screen. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, For the first heaven and the first earth passed away, and there is no longer any sea. Boy, that verse reads differently now, doesn't it? Remember, I was talking to someone at Union about this a few months ago when I was first learning all this stuff, and I brought up this verse, and I just remember they go, that's what that means when it talks about the sea. Now, a lot of people could read this and say, well, maybe when God recreates everything, there won't be any water. I don't think that's the point, though, especially with how symbolic Revelation is. I think his point is, in eternity, all chaos will be gone. That when all is said and done, when evil has been defeated, when the dragon has been defeated, that all of the destruction and the chaos and the randomness and the uncontrollable things in your life that just wreak havoc will be completely done away with. And so, if you are a believer, that is what you have to look forward to. Now, in the life we live right now, the sea is still very much here. There is still very much chaos. But just like it was in this psalm, God is still completely in control. Just like the point that this author is making to his readers, that even through the awful, terrible time of being taken over by Babylon, God is so much in control that we can remember in our lives, when things seem to get bad, that same God is still in control. And we look forward to a future where that chaos that seems to be everywhere will be completely done away with. So if you are a believer, that is what you have to look forward to. If you are not one, all I can say is, how could you say no to that? How could you say no to an eternity where the stormy seas of life torment you no longer? So if you are not a believer, I pray that you will consider that offer and you will say yes to it. So if you will, pray with me, and when we're done, I will open up the altar for anyone who wants to come pray. So please bow your heads and pray with me. Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for the chance for all of us to come here and learn your word. And I pray that if the storms ever take over our life, if the waves seem to be too high, that we remember we serve a God who controls it all. And I pray that we remember that in everything that we do. In your holy name, amen.